SLR camera, you can create artistic photos like the ones shown here. Remember those trips to the museum? Or fancy pictures in your favorite magazines? These effects seem like magic and make motion jump out of the page. They are all computer generated, and with a little practice, you can create professional quality photos too. We'll start by defining common terms and showing how they work on your camera. Then we'll move on to photographic technique. Finally, we'll test you on your knowledge. At the close of this training module, you will be able to define terms that are applicable to blur and freeze motion photography. Adjust your digital camera to create blur and freeze motion effects. Determine the right camera settings for the environmental lighting and desired effects. Take blur and freeze motion photos. Part 1. Terminology. These are the terms we'll discuss in Part 1. Aperture, depth of field, shutter speed, and exposure. Imagine your camera as an eye. Got it? The aperture of the camera is how wide the camera's eye is open. It's measured in f-stops, where a lower number is a wider opening and a higher number is a smaller opening. Depth of field is a measure of how much of the picture will be in focus. A shallow field indicates that only a small portion of the photo is focused. To create a shallow depth of field photograph, the aperture is set wide, which means it has a low f-stop number. A deep field has a large portion of the photo in focus. To create a deep field, the aperture is set narrow. Going back to our eye metaphor, shutter speed is how fast the camera blinks, or how long the camera's shutter is open. Your shutter speed must be adjusted to maintain correct exposure or the brightness of the picture. A longer shutter speed lets in more light and captures a longer moment in time. This has two important points. First of all, longer shutter opening lets in more light, which has to be compensated for by reducing the aperture opening size. And two, longer shutter opening captures a longer moment in time, which could create unintentional blurs with subjects in motion. Keep in mind the relationship between aperture and shutter speed. A narrow aperture will require longer shutter speed to get in the same quantity of light. Look at the gnome photo. It demonstrates a narrow depth of field because it shows the middle gnome, who is the subject, in focus, while those in the fore and deep field are blurred. This requires a wider aperture, which is a low f-stop, and it also requires a somewhat faster shutter speed. Now take a look at this photo. The entire photo appears to be in focus, or relatively so. This requires a narrower aperture or a high f-stop. This will require a somewhat slower shutter speed. Exposure is the total amount of light allowed to fall on the photographic medium during the process of taking a photograph. There's no such thing as perfect exposure. It's all a matter of personal preference. Modern cameras have automatic exposure settings. However, sometimes pictures don't always turn out the way we'd like them to. Understanding exposure helps photographers capture the images they envision. Getting a correct exposure means recording as much of the relevant information in the scene as possible. In this example, the bird is the main focal point. The sky is white because it was brighter than the bird. Had the meter been set to expose the sky, the bird would have been shown as a black silhouette. Here's a useful tip. When using your SLR camera, it's likely that the default metering system is center weighted average, which means that while reading the entire scene, more weight will be placed on what is in the middle of the frame. This reading is taken at the time the button is first pressed. So pushing the button halfway down until a beep is heard will set the focus, aperture, and shutter speed, as well as take the exposure reading. If your main point of interest is not in the center of the frame, move the camera until it is in the center of the frame, push the button halfway down, and hold it. While still holding the button halfway down, move the camera back to the original position so the subject is exactly where you want it to be in the frame, and then press the button completely to take the photograph.